Hi everybody, I'm Zilla Blitz and welcome. Today we're going to take a look at Iraqi Freedom, 30 Days to Baghdad, the second war game published by Accurate Simulations. This game, currently being used by the Air Force War College, focuses on the 2003 Gulf War. Their first game, Desert Storm, focused on the 1991 Gulf War. Let's jump in and take a look. So we've got the components spread out in front of us here. This comes in a baggie. The box that we're looking at is the box for Desert Storm, and I'll talk about that one momentarily. We've got a rules booklet, a supplemental rules booklet for Desert Storm, our two mounted maps, and then some counters. I'll talk about the playing cards in a moment, and then a playing aid up at the top there. Let's do a quick overview of this game before we jump in and get started. As I mentioned, it is currently being used at the Air Force War College for training purposes. Published in 2025, the designer is Eric Harvey. This is a two-player game, although it will work very well in playing solitaire, playing both sides. There's really no hidden information that you have to worry about. Gameplay length, it doesn't mention it anywhere I could see, but I'm going to go about 2.5 hours. And the historical length of the game is the 30 Days to Baghdad, roughly 1 month of this combat. Now, the turn length is indefinite. There isn't a set number of turns that you're playing the game. You're playing it until the US and UK forces take 2 of the 3 hexes of Baghdad, at which point the game ends and you tabulate victory points. We'll talk more on that later. Divisions, brigades, regiments, and battalions are the units in the game. There is 1 company in the game. A big question you may be wondering, is this an expansion to Desert Storm or is it a standalone game? It's kind of halfway in between, to be fair. This rules booklet builds off of the rules booklet in Desert Storm, but the Desert Storm rulebook is not included in Iraqi Freedom. So in order to play Iraqi Freedom, you need the Desert Storm rulebook. Now I talked to the designer. He said if you get Iraqi Freedom but don't have Desert Storm, you can let him know. And if he has a number of extra rulebooks, he will send one along with the game, as well as in the future, he's thinking to make a PDF available of the Desert Storm rulebook for people that just buy this game. However, we'll talk a little bit later. There is a connection, a campaign-ish type of way you can play Desert Storm and then follow it up with Iraqi Freedom. We'll talk about that. So you can link the gameplay between these two games to put together. Now, what kind of things are we looking at in this game? Well, we've got land units and air units. To be fair, there's only 1 air unit left in the Iraqi Air Force for this. It's a hex and counters game. There are hit systems, a dice chucking kind of hit system where you're going to be inflicting step losses on your opponent's units. Now, one of the things that's different between this game, if you've played Desert Storm, this game has, Desert Storm had event cards. This game does not have event cards. However, it does have what are called Iraqi high-value targets. These are the objectives, the people that they were trying to capture, the high-value Iraqi personnel they were trying to capture during the Iraqi Freedom campaign. And we'll talk more about that when we talk a little bit about the card deck that's up there. Now, there's some upgraded weaponry. For example, we've got guided munitions, things like missiles, cruise missiles, smart bombs that are included in this game that really weren't in Desert Storm. Additionally, there are weapons of mass destruction that the US, UK forces are looking for, chemical and biological weapons facilities, nuclear facilities, and missile launcher areas. Let's take a look at the rulebook for Iraqi Freedom 30 Days to Baghdad. This is a 20-page document, including this cover, and we'll note that it does start with 16. So this is a continuation of the rulebook from Desert Storm, which is exactly why you need the rules for Desert Storm. And that brings up an important point. The rules for Desert Storm, for the most part, work with Iraqi Freedom. It's the same type of combat system, movement system. The rules carry over. Now, there are a number of things that are different in here, and these are talked about in dissimilar rules. So main one kind of being no events, and some of the other clarifying cases that are in here. But if you know how to play Desert Storm, the 100-Hour War, you're going to pick up this game in probably a half an hour. It's really easy. So there's really not a heck of a lot different that's going to challenge you once you've figured out Desert Storm. I believe I gave Desert Storm a 3.5 out of 10 on the complexity scale, and that feels roughly the same here. It's not a game that you want to let the complexity in any way, shape, manner, or form scare you away from the game. Most of the big chunk of this rulebook then is talking about the different setup conditions, where units go and how you set up both sides of the forces for the campaign. Then we have some special rules here. So we have the high value targets, which again are a big part of this game that's different than the Desert Storm one. US guided munitions and how those function in the game. Some other units and some special cases about units that are different from Desert Storm. So just some kind of unique munitions and units, as well as the the high-value targets, and then weapons of mass destruction sites and all of the victory points. And we'll talk about these when we look at the map in terms of how you calculate victory. Lastly, we have this campaign game. Yes, we should talk about this. So the way the campaign game works is, depending upon the margin of victory in certain categories of Desert Storm, the Iraqi forces could have a larger replacement capacity in Iraqi Freedom. There also are some different kind of starting units that the US forces get. But so basically that margin of victory is going to make it easier, or if the US has a greater margin of victory, it's going to make it a little bit easier for them in Iraqi Freedom as depleted kind of industrial and military capacity. And if it's a lesser margin of victory in Desert Storm, it's going to be a little bit more challenging for the US and British forces in Iraqi Freedom. Mainly in the game, here's a scenario rule just to point this out. Mainly we have the one main scenario, but there are a lot of variants to it. We've got 4 different variants here: Iraqi army deployment, destroying bridges, friendly fire, and Iraqi reserves that kind of add to that variety here. Then we have some designer notes, and it should be mentioned that, you know, the campaign game is a variant of the base game that's in here. So it's going to modify how the base game plays if you're not playing the 2 scenarios as a connected campaign. And wait, there's more. The game also comes with a Desert Storm supplement, which is an 8-page document that adds some features to the Desert Storm game. The biggest one here, well, probably one of the 2 biggest ones here, are what are called event cards effects. Now, in the first game, in the Desert Storm game, when an event would be triggered, it would influence one of 5 victory tracks in the game. And those victory tracks represented things like political maneuvering, psychological warfare, or diplomacy, public relations, or military achievements. But it was a little bit of an abstract event system. These, when an event card succeeds, you go specifically to look at this card and determine the impact of that event on the Desert Storm battle map itself, right? So it's going to impact the gameplay itself rather than a representation of a change in one of those 5 tracks. So this is more granular, it's more gritty. I think it feels a lot like more effects that are actually happening as the battle is going on. So that's a big change that's added in this supplement. Then there are some errata and clarifications here. And then the third feature, that's a cool feature, this is the one that I was hoping to see, is a historical scenario. So this gives the actual setup for the Desert Storm as it happened historically, and you start on game turn 3 instead of the start because there's some maneuvering at the beginning of Desert Storm. So if you want to see the historical, if you want to play the historical Desert Storm scenario, this is the way you do it, by getting the supplement in here. Let's take a look at our counter sheet. There is one counter sheet with the game. It is printed on both sides. These are 9/16 of an inch counters, and there are 154 of them. A few just general observations. I like the art and design on these. They feel modern and crisp. So we can see the US forces, the US, British, and there are some independent Kurdish, autonomous Kurdish forces up here that have fought for the US and UK side in this. Here are the US aircraft. Here are a variety of different aircraft types, are guided munitions. These are the oil fields. The Iraqi forces can gain victory points by setting fire to oil fields. And here are the counters that are used to represent those high-value targets that the US forces and UK forces were hunting down. Then the Iraqi forces up here. But nice clean counter set. They look like they're going to work really well. Pre-rounded corners, so you do not need your counter clipper for this one. All set to go. The one-player aid is the terrain effects board here. This is a very heavy cardstock board, like the map itself, giving us the terrain, and then the movement cost, and then the combat die roll modifiers for this. So very simple, very elegant. It just can be passed along between players or left beside the map for ease of access. I want to talk about these cards. Now, these cards are not part of the game, but the designer has a number of these decks that he says he will include. I think you might have to ask for it. He will include with people who are buying Iraqi Freedom until they run out. So I don't know what that number is, but he's got a number of these decks that are available. And what these are decks that represent the decks that were given to United States, and I'm not sure if they're given to UK forces as well, that were to help them identify these high-value Iraqi targets that the US was seeking in the 2003 Gulf War. So we can see the ace of spades was Saddam Hussein. So US military forces were given these to be able to identify the Iraqi people that were these high value targets of very high interest to the US. This isn't directly impacting gameplay, but this is a bonus. The designer said he found some of these on eBay, a big package of them, and he picked them up, and so he's giving them away as a bonus to people that order the game until they run out. And I remember in the 2003 war, this was in the news quite often, and these are replicas of those decks. Lastly, let's take a look at our two mounted map boards. These are 17 by 22 inches. And notice the configuration, they don't go lengthwise to lengthwise. They go short end here to the horizontal like this. So your actual footprint is 39 inches on the horizontal and then 22 inches on the vertical. We can see Kuwait down here to our right, Iran to our right, Syria sits over here, and then the vast majority of the map is Iraq, with Baghdad sitting right here. Now, the objective of the game, again, it has an indefinite number of turns. The game ends when the US-UK forces take 2 of the 3 hexes in Baghdad. That triggers the end game. And up until that point, at that point in the game, you calculate victory points depending upon a number of factors. And there are a number of ways the US and UK forces can get victory points. You get +1 point for any one of the weapons of mass destruction sites. You get +1 point for the 22 high-value targets. And you can also, when you capture a high-value target, one of them could be Saddam Hussein. That gets you 5 points if you capture Saddam Hussein. Now, the Iraqi forces, for every turn that Baghdad is not captured, they get +1 points. And then for every high-value target that they're able to escape off the map, they get a point as well. Then, casualties for the US-UK forces factor in as well. For every unit reduced for the US-UK, the Iraqi forces get +1. For every unit eliminated, they get +2. So as the US, you're trying to balance speed, getting to Baghdad because you're losing points for every turn that you're not there, capturing the high-value targets and minimizing losses. And the Iraqi forces are trying to do the exact opposite. The last thing that the Iraqi forces can do, they get a victory point every time they set fire to an oil well and put one of those on fire as well. I like this map. I like the art design, and it's very similar to the Desert Storm map. I believe it's about 10 miles across on a hex. I think that's what it was in Desert Storm. The hex size here is 3/4 of an inch, and the stacking in the game is very modest. 2 ground units and 2 air units in a hex. The one thing I will say, I've had this out on the table here for a few days now, and I've noticed just a very slight bowing in some of these. Sometimes when there's a lot of glue on these, I think they can get a little bit of a curve to them. So I would probably put a box on them, something heavy on them to flatten out, or I might play with plexiglass on top of the maps to kind of keep them nice and flat. The only thing we really haven't talked about is solitaire. I'll give this 6.5 out of 10. There's nothing in here that prevents you from playing it. There's no hidden information that prevents you from playing it both sides. So it works really well as a solitaire system. And yet, there is no bot for either side or rules guidance for solitaire. So if you are playing it solitaire, you're alternating sides and playing both sides that way. Some thoughts as we wrap up. I was really impressed with Desert Storm, Accurate Simulation's first game, and I really like the looks of this one. Desert Storm was a very accessible, easy to play game that was quite a bit of fun and got you into the history behind the 1991 conflict. And I'm particularly, I like the way, you don't know until you play it, right? But I really like the feel of the fact that, capturing Baghdad is inevitable. What you're trying to do as the two opposing forces is the difference in victory, right? How big is that victory going to be for the US and UK forces? How many of those high value targets can you capture? How much of the oil capacity can you still have intact? And then, just kind of getting to Baghdad quickly is another factor as well, and minimizing losses or maximizing losses if you're the Iraqi forces to maximize losses of the US and UK forces. So very elegant design. I'm impressed with their work, and they know their rule book is very clean and crisp, and there's a lot of dedication and focus put into this game. So, it's a very much a labor of love as they're starting to build up their company here. If you have liked this video, we do have a playthrough of Desert Storm on the channel, so you can get a sense for how gameplay works in this system because there's such a large overlap. I'll put a link to that video up here. I'm happy to entertain any questions about Iraqi Freedom as well.